Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our Signal webinar series. I'm Kimberly Underwood, Senior Editor at AFCEA International's Signal magazine. I'd like to welcome you today to our webinar entitled The DoDIN APL Certification, a Labor of Love. The Department of Defense is looking to harness more and more commercial solutions from the industry. In order to be a supplier of products to DoD, however, companies need to go through formal military approvals, such as the Department of the Navy's Application and Database Management System process, known as DADAMS, or the Army's Certificate of Networthiness, or CON, accreditation. Commercial vendors with technology meant for sensitive networks, such as the Department of Defense Information Network, or DoDIN, also known as the DoDIN, must go through the Approved Products List process of the Defense Information Systems Agency, or DISA. This approval, known as the DoDIN APL certification, dictates a high level of security, interoperability, and scalability. For companies going through the rigorous process of product testing, validation, certification, and selection, it may seem like a labor of love, say experts John Downey and Neil Proctor from Acronis SCS. Acronis SCS is a cyber protection and edge data security company that is sponsoring today's webinar, and they are currently going through the DoDIN APL certification. John and Neil will share their experience of the process, talk about the ins and outs, and why it is important for companies to have commercial off-the-shelf products that enable DoD's mission and secure its systems and networks. John Downey is a Vice President of Sales at Acronis SCS. John has 15 years of experience selling enterprise information security and data protection software in the U.S. public sector. His expertise lies in mapping product capabilities to key federal government policies, creating enterprise license agreements for systems integrators, and developing sales strategies. John has a bachelor's degree from Towson University in Maryland. Neil is the Vice President of Engineering and R&D for Acronis SCS and is responsible for the company's team and the processes that ensure products are trusted with complete traceability. He also oversees the research and development of new features geared toward providing public sector backup and data protection products. Prior to joining Acronis SCS, Neil worked for GoDaddy for 13 years, leading web application development and information security architecture. He was general manager for the GoDaddy's community division and business unit manager for the company's marketing applications product suite. His expertise in software development centers on application security and quality assurance. And Neil holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the University of Arizona. During today's webinar, we encourage you to submit questions. You can do this electronically through the Ask a Question box on the webinar console. When our experts have finished presenting, we'll have a Q&A for as long as time permits during this hour-long session. John, could you start us off by telling us a little bit about Acronis SCS and what the webinar will cover?
Sure. Thank you, Kim, and thanks to AFCEA for having us here for this webinar today. As you mentioned, I'm John Downey, VP of Sales for Acronis SCS, and I'll be providing the first half of the information session here. I'll be kind of providing a narrative discussing how and why we got to the conclusion to put our products on the DoDIN APL, as well as these other prerequisite certifications that are required to get a product on the APL. We're going to give you a little very brief background about who we are and who we serve in the DoD space. We'll talk a little bit about the common DoD cyber challenges and then those that we focus on in particular, particularly around mission critical systems as opposed to data protection generally. Then we'll talk about some of the other APLs that you folks are probably very familiar with. Kim alluded to them, such as the DADAMS and the Army Con, things of that nature, and our experience with getting on those as well versus our experience of attempting to get on the APL. Then I'll turn it over to Neil Proctor, and he will discuss in detail the technical components of satisfying all of these common criteria, Phipps and APL certification standards, and what we've had to do to architect our product in such a way that it fit all the components and standards that are there within each one of these independent buckets of certification steps. We'll then bring it back to kind of summarize our findings, open it up to Q&A after that. And so one of the things that we want to address up front is that we are not actually through the certification process. We thought it'd be interesting to do one of these webinars kind of right up until the point and talk about all the things we had to do with our product and positioning in order to get into the evaluation status. And then we'd like to potentially do another follow-up webinar to see what sort of things transpired between right now in evaluation and the actual completion of receiving the certifications on the products that we're putting through for evaluation. So, again, full disclosure, we do not have a full story to tell yet about going through the full process. We thought it might be interesting to just kind of discuss as we are live in the process today about how we got to where we are and what we see between now and the end of the road there for the certifications. And for the other vendors on the line, we'll discuss timelines and kind of processes and things like that will hopefully be helpful for any vendors listening as part of the AFCEA community to help them make a decision whether or not to go down this journey and this land of investment we've had to make with personnel and resources to further satisfy the DoD's requirements to ensure that our existing customers can continue to use products and services that they've been familiar with for almost 2 decades. Now, as we see increasing policy come in and make requirements more stringent for technology being introduced or even to continue being used in certain environments for the DoD. So again, very brief, we'll just give you a quick synopsis of who we are. Acronis SCS is a U.S.-based company headquartered in Scottsdale, Arizona. All of our employees are U.S. citizens. That includes our support group, all of Neil's team in R&D, sales, administration, so forth. It's a prerequisite to work here. All of our products are, signed and delivered here from the U.S., satisfying a number of preliminary requirements in order to sell to the DoD. We found that a lot of our customers really enjoying having the U.S.-based support as just a primary advantage of dealing with a U.S.-based company. Our track record is that we've been selling these products, as I said, almost for 2 decades into large environments, sensitive but unclassified, classified networks, as well as unclass. And we'll talk a little bit about where we fit in particular. I promise this is not a sales pitch, but we just want to give you guys some context as to where we fit within the DoD architecture and why we felt it was necessary to undergo this process of getting on the APL. So there's no lack of news bites or sound bites, right, in the media every day about that the DoD is a target, right? And what we commonly hear, not just in the DoD, but in the commercial landscape as well, is that, a network was breached and data was stolen, right? It was a data theft incident, personally identifiable information, just PII and so forth, has been taken and removed from a network through some sort of hack or phishing scam or something of that nature. And while those are obviously very important, what we're going to focus on here today is the operational assurance aspect of what we provide for mission-critical systems. And we'll get more into detail about those. But I think we could all agree that my Social Security number being stolen from OPM, a couple of years back, is obviously a personal issue for me, and it's an issue of national security. But somebody shutting down the power grid, the nation's power grid, I think we could argue is probably something that we need to be paying equal, if not more, attention to, in terms of protecting that critical infrastructure that powers the nation for the warfighter that is in theater, for training, data analytics, all these things that are technically classified information that should not be let out in any capacity, and these functions that these devices we protect serve in order to support the mission, enable the mission in a safe way that satisfies all requirements that the DoD might have for us. So just an idea about where we fit is, as Kim mentioned, we are more of an edge data protection. We don't necessarily sit in the data center very often, but where we do exist are on SCADA infrastructure. We sit on battleships, on jets, on tough books in the military out in theater. We're actually used in some development labs to build these custom applications and proprietary systems that the integrator community puts together for the DoD constituents. And so we're generally, one of many applications that are being integrated into a platform by General Dynamics or Lockheed or Northrop, and then they're submitting that and putting it in production in a DoD environment. We're also very prevalent in training simulators for unmanned aircraft, manned aircraft, ships and things of that nature. So we're protecting the stacks that run all those programs as well as the data that they generate and sit somewhere in a centralized location, under lock and key. And we're also very commonly used in air-gapped networks. So our hardened product is kind of designed specifically to not need to communicate in or out in any capacity, that all the credentials and things of that nature, that one needs to install our solution and deploy agents within an enclosed network. We support a lot of air-gapped environments that are typically managed by the federal systems integrators in some capacity, weapons, ranges, and things of that nature. The mobile endpoints, we also have protection for, as I mentioned, laptops, mobile devices that are obviously a more connected nature. But our core focus is really on those secure enclaves in these air-gapped networks predominantly, and in theater and production on these critical mission systems. Things supporting like communications protocols on the LCS combat ships, navigation systems, weapon systems on the littoral combat ships is probably one of our biggest use cases there. So when we talk about why we decided to go down this path of getting on the APL, it's no wonder that with all the increased scrutiny on these public data thefts, the way that policy we've seen shifting, congressional leadership wanting to ensure that the nation's architecture managed by the DoD is locked down and protected and as unified in terms of the standards that these products have to have in order to sit on the network. We've seen kind of a gap between what policy is driving and what our existing customers are used to as it relates to just procuring goods and services that they've already been accustomed to over the years. So we're seeing increased stringency on the policy side that has kind of created some issues and some holdups for our customer base because they previously did not necessarily need these things in order to operate. Prime example is NASA. Many of the space centers, now have a new requirement to engage the FBI to do a background check on any vendors that are in their environment, that they're thinking about bringing into their environment. That's a relatively new development that they've had to go through just to justify using existing technology, whether it's VMware, Red Hat, all these major components that you guys are familiar with using on a day-to-day basis. We're just seeing a lot more scrutiny placed on any architecture, whether it's classified or even in sensitive but unclassified environments, such as our customers there at NASA. The interesting thing is that the answer for all that is these APLs, right? So how do we determine what is a standardized certification or validation process in order to say, yes, this product should be on the network, no, this product should not? And in our experience, we have a lot of experience being on those other branch-specific APLs, approved product lists, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here now. And what the difference we've seen is going through the DoDIN APL certification process versus getting on these branch-specific APLs. So, for instance, we mentioned the Navy's probably our largest DoD customer. So older versions of our products have been on the DATMs. A couple versions back, it seemed to be there was a test about operability and functionality and utility of the product. And we had to make sure that it did what we said it did, that it's, didn't throw any haywire protocols in a customer's environment, whether it was in a lab or in production, and depending upon the class of the network on which the product was sitting, that seemed to be sufficient enough years ago. And so what we've seen comparatively, I should say contrastingly, is with the DoDIN APL, which Mr. Proctor will get more into later on in this presentation. There's some significant architectural changes we had to make to satisfy this larger, DoDIN-wide APL approved products list standardization. And we'll talk more about each one of those components and what we've had to do just to get to this point to be in evaluation for the APL. But what we've seen then is that, because there may be a gap between policy and directives and the stringency with, pointing to the APL as kind of the end-all, be-all point for a COTS solution, which is commercial off-the-shelf software for both integrators and DoD end users alike to pull from when they're considering adding technology to their environment. We're seeing that a lot of the APLs that are branch-specific might not be as stringent from a security perspective, whereas they're focused more on operability and utility, as I mentioned. And so, for instance, our older version of the products that we're sitting on DATMs, which are now outdated and end of life, but they did not have Phipps 140-True. They were not common criteria certified. And that's not to say that any of our Navy counterparts that were evaluating our software were trying to skirt around standardizations. It just shows that the level to which the security scrutiny has increased has outpaced, I think, some of the defined processes and protocols for getting on these branch-specific APLs. And that's why we made the decision to get on the DoDIN APL, because we view it as the kind of highest standard that would be applicable across any of our federal government or system integrator customer base, regardless of what environment our product ultimately sits in to protect. So we're going to turn it over here to Neil Proctor in a moment, but we did want to just kind of give you all a primer if you are not familiar with the kind of the three major components for getting on the DoDIN APL. The first is the Phipps 140-2 standard. This deals with specifically the encryption methodologies and libraries within a component. So it's focused primarily on the build and integration of a product that's going to sit on the network. The next step is common criteria, which kind of builds on top of that and then looks more closely at the communication protocols within the application itself, as well as to other components outside the network that it might need to communicate with. So in our instance, we're primarily a backup and disaster recovery product, so we're storing images of disks and data volumes, and we need to send that to some storage repository, right, whether it's a SAN or a NAS. So the common criteria looks at all the ways in which your product talks within itself and outside of itself, and ensures that it's not trying to phone home to anywhere, and that there's no capability for a kill switch to be engaged, and that everything is self-contained and operable there within the build that is deployed with the executable or whatever method it might be to exist in that environment. And then the DoDIN APL takes all that aggregate standardization, and it takes it a step further to look more closely then at user login, credentials, how those things are stored, how they're activated, authentication, and user activities, so things like logging to make sure that credentials aren't being moved around by personnel that are not permitted to access them, things of that nature. So I think with that, fair warning, this next part is going to get rather technical in nature, and that's why we have Neil here. And he's going to walk us through each one of these components and talk about some of the changes we had to make, some of the inconsistencies we found with established architectures, and things that were available to allow a vendor like ourselves to actually prepare themselves, right, from a product perspective, from a documentation perspective, just to get to this evaluation stage, so that we were bringing something to our group at Fort Huachuca who's doing the evaluation in a state that is, architecturally, fundamentally the way it needs to be to get through the process of the certifications. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Proctor.
Thanks, John. I'm Neil Proctor. I'm the Vice President of Engineering for Acronis SCS, and let's talk certifications. You don't have to thank me now, but if you have any parties to attend later today, this will be super handy. So right off the bat, I'll tell you that this is a significant investment in both time, development, testing, and auditing resources. So today we wanted to tell you, why would we do it? Well, we had our public sector customers asking us about it, and when we looked deep into it, we concluded that this would be an important investment, and we wanted to take today to walk you through why we think this is an important investment. So first up is Phipps. So why is Phipps important? Is it because it's so Phipps-tastic? We've tried to answer that ourselves. And we found that for those of you that might not know about Phipps, I'll provide a little bit of background. It is the specification that specifies in excruciating detail how a system uses encryption and how you can use the algorithms and the exact components with a finite state model around what sort of hardware is required, as well as any sort of default entry points, entropy, etc. So I'll go through a couple of the pain points that we had. First off, there's a current version of Phipps that is 2.0, and this has gotten aged support from the current open source community, and that is largely due to the fact that there's another 3.0 standard coming out, and the open source community is a little bit hesitant to keep supporting 2.0 when 3.0 is just around the corner. And I think we've been talking about 3.0 for quite a few years, so it's pretty acceptable to realize that there's not a lot of gain in supporting updates to an older spec. And so with that, we had to solve some of these changes in the spec that the current software didn't solve. And so the first point was the default entry point and the self-tests that had to be performed without any sort of application operator interaction. And so what that meant for us was that we had to develop a new way of instantiating the encryption module such that it didn't require any callbacks from the application before the DLL actually returned access back to the application. And one of the headaches was there's another requirement of using a very strong source of entropy, one that's been very well defined. The current Microsoft ones just weren't available for us because of the proprietary nature. So luckily we had some support staff that was able to determine that the Intel chip now had some standard entropy generation that was done in the chip itself. So integrating that was one of the challenges we had, especially since we support a lot of cross-platform environments. And lastly, the RSA keygen that was currently in our library did not support probable primes. So that was another addition that we had to make. All right, so that brings us to common criteria and why this was important. So we thought this was important because it describes the controls necessary for a system at large and not just a specific module. So this involved a lot of the application interaction between the various types of systems. So most of these controls were already good security practices and made the product more secure. And more importantly, it's the standard that many of the federal agencies now require, and it's supported worldwide. I believe 30+ countries make use of these standards. So some of the challenges for us in implementing common criteria was, one, it required that all of your encryption be done through this Phipps module. So these certifications had to build on each other. When we looked into all of the different application modules that did encryption, we found there was several native languages that didn't have a Phipps compatible encryption module. So for instance, things like Python and Go, and even some of the C++ statically linked libraries didn't have Phipps compatible module. So we had to recompile or do some workarounds to integrate our version of that Phipps module into those native languages. The other things that we thought were beneficial with common criteria were the TLS wrapper for all of the communication between all of the modules. It very specifically calls out a version 1.2 with a very specific set of sessions and ciphers, session renegotiation, and a very specific set of ciphers. And one of the other challenges were some of the PKI and CA check requirements. So out in normal SSL and TLS communication, a lot of the times it's not very necessary to check some of the revocation status. And a lot of people have argued that it doesn't make any sense to check revocation status and instead just use shorter-lived certificates. But regardless, this is one of the specifications in the common criteria requirements. So we added those checks to very securely check revocation status of all of those certificates. One of the other challenges was the storage of secrets. So any encryption keys or any secret authentication keys are mandated to be stored in an OS platform keyring. And so for Windows, that's pretty easy. For Mac, that was pretty easy, but for Linux, it was a little bit more difficult due to the fact that it wasn't built in to the distributions and required us to use something like GNOME keyring. Some of the other flags that we had to work with were some of the compilation flags to prevent buffer overflows and to allow dynamic memory allocation, auto updates, and very specific guidelines on where configuration files are stored and which users have access to those configuration files. And finally, this brings us to the DoDIN APL. So as we mentioned earlier, this one builds upon a lot of the investment we made in Phipps and common criteria, and it provides more STIGs for things like user access. And luckily, many of these STIGs get already satisfied by integrating with things like Active Directory. So there's a ton of built-in logging that we made use of just by integrating our user directory with Active Directory. We get events such as when users get added, when they get deleted, when they log in, when they log off, and all of those are requirements in the DoDIN APL. One of the other big requirements was ensuring that all of those logs get sent to central logging mechanisms. So making use of syslog was an important way we satisfied that criteria. The other important components were DoD-specific login and log-off banners, as well as a lot of configuration around how cookies and sessions are handled. And additionally, there were some more PKI and TLS properties, such as setting the default TLS session to 1 hour, and some rate limiting requirements where you're required to configure very specific numbers of allowable simultaneous user connections. So all in all, these STIGs get very detailed. And again, this is an important investment that we felt would make our product better and more secure for the sensitive networks that we plan on deploying into. All right, so to wrap up, I will pass it back to John Downey, and he'll have something that you'll enjoy coming up.
Thanks, Neil. So, in summary, again, because we are just to the point where we're in evaluation, we're shipping our stuff to Fort Huachuca, they're going to go through all of our code and documentation and in gritty detail and give us feedback. We're not sure how much augmentation will need to occur between now and the actual certification being awarded. We hope that this was enough to give you folks just a purview of what folks have to do in order to get to this point. There were a couple of questions that came through we'll answer here momentarily that I think are pretty interesting and kind of speak to our overarching theme here. But to summarize things, if you're a vendor listening to this presentation, I can tell you that it's not an easy sell, right, to make the investment in both time and resources that Neil alluded to the R&D focus for, especially if you're in a saturated marketplace like us, you have to constantly be innovating, right, with newer protocols, new APIs, right, as we move to a more connected world. A lot of our vendors in this industry, in this space, are actually moving upstream, right, and so they're trying to provide platform products and cloud applications as a service because, that's where they see the market going. Obviously, people are trying to reduce costs, operability, and storage needs, things of that nature, and eliminate the need to manage all that on-premise. But for our DoD customers, for our SCADA systems that we protect with the DOE, the combat ships, the training simulators, so, they have no interest in having anything be connected to their classified or sensitive but unclassified networks. So we actually decided to retrofit our product, remove all those connectivity capabilities, right, and so that we can continue to serve in those environments for legacy applications, for proprietary applications that just have no interest in connecting to the outside world in any capability. It's a tough sell to go to management and say, look, guys, I think we need to invest this money, these time, and these resources when they're looking at, everybody in the industry kind of moving up to a more connected world. It definitely took some convincing, right? Because everybody wants to know what the addressable budget is going to be, what the addressable market might be. And at the end of the day, it's, look, we're sitting in these critical infrastructure. It has to happen. They want to continue using us, but they're saying policy is now, making it harder and harder to just continue using COTS solutions or to procure new COTS solutions that have not gone through the DoDIN APL, and certainly if they don't have common criteria for at least a minimum. Phipps has been around. It's been very common. But for a vendor like ourselves, and this might actually answer one of the questions that's in the queue, we were originally born out of the consumer marketplace. We have a product called True Image that's used by over 5 million people worldwide, and a number of our systems integrators customers came to us because of their experience on the consumer side. So when you're building a consumer product, generally speaking, you're not paying a whole lot of attention to DoD requirements, right, as it relates to standards of security built within the product. And so what we found is that because it was an easy-to-use project, it was very cost-effective, easy-to-use product, very cost-effective, folks were trying to bring that sort of capability into their environment within the DoD network or in the civilian network. And then that's where we started, approaching this challenge, right, of, okay, so operability, utility is there, but does it have all these checkboxes, right, that it needs to sit here? And so, migrating from that kind of market, finding that there was a demand for a backup and imaging tool that can be used with bootable media or, across any platform for DevOps, for disaster recovery, you have to then learn along with other vendors in the space, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into supporting this environment. So if your core focus coming out of the gate as a startup or a new technology is not to support the DoD architecture, you really have to sit and analyze, how much success in the future you're going to have in that space if you choose not to go through these sorts of processes. But the thing here that we want to draw everybody's attention to is that, we believe the DoDIN APL is the gold standard for security and operability. But it's challenging for vendors to go through because there's generally a lack of publicized guidance, right, for how to maintain your products and services, especially when you're using components of your product that are from an open source community, right? It seems like it would be very useful if there was some level of resource there that provided guidance to open source developers that if you're creating these things for specific use cases and the intention is to be in these networks, these are some of the things you should consider while compiling your code and so forth, and using other open source components. We found that probably would have saved us a fair amount of time. And that kind of brings to the last bullet point here, is that the working implementations for good reason, aren't really shared as examples. So I don't know that when we're done all this, we're going to certainly publish, a white paper as to the step-by-step guide and what we did to our product and provide all the ins and outs. That would kind of defeat the purpose of having these standards applied and evaluated within the DoD. But the other, of course, is the time to market, right? This process is probably going to take us, when it's all said and done, at a minimum of a year and a half. And that's not even counting the decision-making process, folks like myself within the organization having to sell this idea to management, right, and go over the numbers and talk about where this utility is and how much upside there is. But, it's an undertaking, right? And so what we see here is the self-inflicting situation is, policy is advancing in the most secure direction it's probably ever been. And folks understand that they need to get these vendors' products, but the DoDIN APL itself was originally kind of created for network communication, firewalls, switches, routers, things of that nature. And so we actually had to create our own category within the cybersecurity profiles of common criteria that included a real enterprise capability of having a management server and an agent that would sit on a device and to be used in tandem that way. So we've had to kind of create our own protection profiles to get on the APL, just kind of pointing to that there's no standardized or published kind of use case or technology to look to that we could have kind of replicated. So it was a lot of leveraging consultants and putting our products in such a way in an architectural design, eliminating any outside communication, and then bringing that to them and saying, does this satisfy? Does this satisfy? And then come back and tweak it and say, no, it has to be just so. right? These code has to be written just this, using just these libraries and so forth. And so it's been a fair amount of back and forth to get to this point just for the evaluation. And then, to Neil's point, the standard for Phipps could change between now and then. We don't really know. So it's a labor of love for sure. We think it's certainly worth it. We'll update you guys in another webinar probably after it's done. But I think at this point we'll probably turn it over to Kim, the moderator, to facilitate the Q&A.
Thanks, John. As a reminder, to submit questions, use the Ask a Question box on the webinar console. We have a few questions already, including several about Phipps. You guys talked about kind of the pain points around Phipps. So one of the questions is asking, Phipps has been a federal law for all federal agencies for about 20 years. Why is this a surprise, and how could this be an unknown? Were there other aspects about having to deal with the Phipps standards other than dealing with the 2.0 version, knowing that 3.0 was coming? I guess, what would you say to this question?
So I'll take the first part of that question, Neil, and if you want to expand on the second part about the actual version of Phipps. So Phipps is not an unfamiliar term, I think, to anybody in this landscape from an industry perspective, right? I think the challenge has been is that, as I alluded to before, is that we were successfully selling our product into the DoD landscape without technically having Phipps on the product. So yes, it's a rule. Yes, it's a standard. And I think the point where we are at now is that people are looking back at all the standards that have been in place and wondering if they've really been enforced. And that's why we see the weight of the DoDIN APL becoming greater and more emphasized moving forward as systems integrators and DoD folks are looking to include COTS solutions for their projects and for their environments. So it wasn't an unknown to us that it was something that needed to be. We actually ended up adding Phipps to the product before we decided to go through this process because it was something that was, hindering procurement a lot of times. And so that kind of brings us to this other point of does every tech and system integrator within the space know what all the standards are and what the protocols are for filling a single line item in a bill of materials on a contract, for instance, right? The thing that we found more and more is that folks were evaluating us whether because they had personal use and comfortability with the product from the consumer version, or they'd used us on another project for a different integrator or for a different branch of the military, and they were familiar with our technology, and they wanted to bring it in to satisfy a requirement for a contract they were fulfilling. And, it runs as expected and everything is status quo, and then when they go to procure it for that environment, that's when the check boxes come out, right? And the contracting officer starts saying, well, you got to show me it's Phipps validated, or, for this particular environment, it has to have common criteria certification. So I think we see, and I'm sure there's a number of vendors in this space that can attest to this, that, you're going down and you're almost to the goal line with delivering a product to a customer. And, procurement is just being held up, and then they're coming back and saying, oh, well, we need to have all these check boxes marked. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen, right? And so we've seen an increase in that over time, which kind of helped justify the investment we've had to make here. But certainly with, older versions of our product, as I mentioned, on some of the APLs, it just, the standard's there, but it didn't preclude us from existing on these networks. And that's not to say our product obviously was not safe and secure to begin with, but just not to this DoDIN standard. Does that answer the question, hopefully, Amy? I don't know if you can reply, but that's kind of been our experience with,
yes,
satisfying some standards and not others.
Yep, and there's another kind of related Phipps question. The viewer is asking, what are your plans to overcome the fact that OpenSSL Phipps support will end in December 2019, with generally no available Phipps 3.0 until sometimes later in 2020? How do you plan to support your Phipps solution during this time?
So we will be certified with the current version of OpenSSL as of December 2019. And if there are any security vulnerabilities that get identified, we'll patch those and release those out to our customers. Now, obviously, that changes some of the Phipps validation portion. And during this time period that you mentioned between the end of this year and when Phipps 3.0 comes out, there is that risk that OpenSSL won't release any of these patches, but there are plenty of people in the open source community that if the vulnerability is important enough, they will patch their versions. For instance, Red Hat maintains their own version of OpenSSL, and so we'll incorporate those same patches into our modules as well.
Okay, thanks, Neil. We have a question dealing with the evaluation assessment. The person asked, if you are being evaluated against a particular profile, which profile is it? And are you considered a network appliance or a software application?
So that's a good question. That was a little bit of the debate when we first started down this process, because our particular solution involves both a client and a server portion. And because of that, it seems like it should be a network appliance, but it's really just a software application. And so this is where we had to come up with a custom solution and create two different security targets, both as software applications, but one security target focusing on the server, and then the second security target focusing strictly on the agent.
Great, thank you. And what made you all decide to pursue going after the DoDIN APL rather than continue with the branch-specific certifications or APL lists?
Great question. So, as I think I alluded to, we have been on a number of the APLs, and there's a process there for one branch to leverage another branch's APL through generally a letter of concurrency. However, it was not very clean and defined, and it was obviously very time-consuming to orchestrate that, right, with your interested stakeholder on one branch, leveraging the work another branch has done. It's not exactly apples to apples, right? And so we just found, again, the issue being held up a lot of times at procurement when everybody on the purchasing side, besides contracting, had kind of signed off on the technology and the price and the level of service they were going to get from the EULA perspective. All the due diligence was done, right? But then we would still be hung up on these elements about the standardization and whether it existed across a more broad APL. So that kind of forced us to say, all right, well, we're not going to, hunt and peck and try to get on these different APLs on a case-by-case basis. Even though we've been successful in the past, we felt like it's worth the investment to be just part of the DoD standard, right, which eliminates a lot of that back-end headache, so we can continue to, sell into the environments where we currently exist and hope to branch, obviously, into new environments.
Okay, thanks, John. And what are the risks in choosing solutions that are not on the DoDIN APL? This kind of asks you to kind of look from the government's point of view of, choosing other from other standards or other lists other than DoDIN. And I guess the flip side of that is for a company only to be on DoDIN APL versus the other service standards. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, I think one is, I think in time, I would imagine that more and more vendors are going to have to migrate to this to continue selling into the environments, particularly as they become moving upstream to these more connected enterprise environments, right? But for us that are on classified networks and air-gapped networks and things of that nature, you have to make significant technology changes in order to sit in an environment where they don't even want connectivity. So, for instance, older versions of our product, a lot of vendors are moving towards subscription-based licensing, right, which has to communicate to that deployment somewhere in the environment to check the life cycle of that serial key to see when it's, whether the subscription has been renewed or whether it has not, right? And unfortunately, for a lot of our customer base, shareholders and investors kind of win out on that argument. Everybody in the industry loves recurring revenue, right, from a subscription perspective. So you add that technology or that capability into your technology to, it makes everybody's life easier. It allows folks to renew kind of ad hoc as needed without going through a ton of paperwork or whatever it might be. But there's these inbound, outbound calls now being made to your product that it sits in a classified network or a sensitive network, and that's an absolute no-no, right? And I think we can all agree nobody wants that. In a DoD environment, particularly if you're sitting on a device, that's controlling weapon systems or navigation or communications. So hardening that product then was paramount for us to continue selling into this space. And so what we found is that this has been made mention, I think, publicly as well, is the DoD, not just the testing labs, but folks like Katie Arrington, who are now trying to evaluate and put in very more clearly unified policy around cybersecurity tools in their environment. They don't just want you to have removed the features or functionality that could be a call in, call out. They want you to actually have that code removed entirely from the product and have evidence that it has done so. So just simply graying out an option, to check a license validity or something of that nature is not sufficient. You have to go in and adjust the UI, and you got to take all that code out and show that it's been removed. And we've learned that through this DoDIN process, right? It's not just this functionality is no longer in this build, but then you deploy it and the buttons are grayed out or what have you. They want to have you show and demonstrate that you've completely removed that functionality at the code level.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. The next question points to kind of what have your other customers thought as you're going through this process. How have your customers or even potential customers reacted to you going through the certification process? And is being in process enough for them to move forward in their procurement processes?
That's a great question. So there hasn't been a single one of our customers, whether it's a federal system integrator, a DoD end user across any branch, that has questioned this maneuver, right, for us to make this investment. The question we get is, when is it going to be generally available, right? When are you getting the certs? What is your tracking number, right, to be an evaluation? Because this is something we know, the DoD tends to know that this is such a large investment from both time and resources that if you're getting to the evaluation phase, you're not just going to all of a sudden stop pursuing the certifications halfway through, right? It's too much of a heavy lift just to get to this point. So they've been able to at least allow that process for evaluation. They might put it in a lab that's not connected to anything else for testing purposes, but it has allowed us to get into the customer bases that know that they need this product in there in an air-gapped environment, and it has allowed them to at least test and start doing the functionality verification so that when the certs hit or they can start the process of procurement, putting it on their wish list for end-of-year funding, whatever that might be, is at least helping us get through a couple of the hurdles while we're going through this process, and certainly opening up newer doors and relationships with other integrators with whom we have not previously done business with.
Thanks, John. And to both of you, what is your take on whether or not organizations outside of DoD should consider adopting the APL requirement? And if so, what benefit would there be for those organizations?
I can speak to it from a sales perspective. So Acronis SES is focused on the public sector in its entirety. So that's just federal government systems integrators, as well as the state, local, and education. And so some of the biggest traction we're seeing from the SLED market in particular is a lot around elections board security, right? We have a number of customers across the nation that have used us for that, and they're very excited about a hardened product that has been verified to not have any inbound, outbound communications, for reasons I think we can all point back to several years ago, where election security, became a major focus, right? So there's lots of applications for providing a COTS solution, not just to the DoD that's been hardened, but also to the other public sector markets. We also see this being very valuable to highly regulated industries, right? Energy, utilities, financial groups as well. And so there's always going to be that need for that connectivity, that SaaS model, right, to improve productivity and drive down costs. But when it comes to the secret sauce in any organization and making sure that that's being backed up, available to be replicated for disaster recovery purposes, you don't want any inside-outside communication. So I think we're going to see a shift in the commercial landscape as well, of more and more folks gravitating towards these things that have been, look, if it's good enough for the DoD network and it can sit on a Marine Corps ship or a Navy ship, then why make the argument about another product who can do similar functionality but has not gone through the rigorous testing and been validated in the nation's most highly classified and secured environments.
And regarding the relationship to commercial solutions for classified, does the DoDIN APL process apply to commercial solutions for classified, considering the program has an approved product list?
That's a great question, and to be honest, I'm not sure the answer to that. Obviously, the branch-specific APLs or program-specific APLs exist for a reason, and I don't know if the DoDIN APL will ultimately be the go-to standardization process and that will replace these other APLs. That's something I don't know that would happen anytime soon. But that's a great question. We'd probably have to look into that and probably talk to our counterparts who are doing testing for us down at the JITC in Fort Huachuca about what they see as it relates to that sort of classification or that standardization, being equivalent or a little bit less than, or if there are some caveats to being on one and not the other. That's a great question.
Okay, thanks. And how about the difference between being Phipps compliant and Phipps certification? Have you come across situations where the COTR gets particular with the difference between those two, or is that the same thing?
Neil, do you want to talk about that from a technical perspective, and then I can address it from a business interaction, engagement, and purchasing perspective?
Sure. So technically, we could get DoDIN APL listing and common criteria just by using an off-the-shelf Phipps compliance or Phipps certified module, and then we would be compliant just by using that module. But that really handcuffs your ability to do any sort of custom integrations that you might need to do. So that's why we made the choice to go with OpenSSL, where we could add the small bit of customizations that we need to do and then get that certified as a module itself. And then we would be Phipps validated with that module and hence providing the compliance into our overall package to allow us to achieve the common criteria and the DoDIN APL certifications.
Thanks, Neil. And then
Kim, I wanted to just address the second part of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think to build on top of that, what I've seen in my interactions with customer bases about, validating our technology for use in their project or their environment, is that, again, the technical folks that are evaluating the product don't really have much of a preference either way. But when you get to the contracting officer, it has come back to have us clarify. And in one instance, before we went down this path, we did have the Phipps validation that we had in the older product not be sufficient enough. It was not equivalent to what they required for that particular environment for the use case in which our product was being procured, that we actually had to put the brakes on that procurement and point to, the certification aspect of Phipps being our target goal, as opposed to just being Phipps validated. But great question. I would say that it generally depends on what the use case is, where exactly you're sitting, what type of network, what sort of data you're touching, what sort of applications you're interacting with. That kind of defines the contracting guidelines there, I believe.
Okay, and can you all share the open source package names that you've used to help build your product? Possibly OpenSSL or OpenLDAP for AD integration on Linux-based systems, or are there any others?
Yeah, so we obviously use OpenSSL, as we alluded to earlier. One of the other wrappers we use for that in Golang is SpaceMonkey, and just like any other off-the-shelf COTS product, we use the standard set of open source libraries that just about every other COTS product uses.
Okay, thanks, Neil. And how about, can you talk about what is involved in the testing part of the evaluation process? How much time have you spent in actual testing? And do you have JITC or contractor costs for DISA's part to do their part of the testing? Can you talk about the testing?
Sure. So I can tell you that the majority of the time testing has been our own internal testing, testing all of the changes that we've made to our application in order to support all of these requirements, and then ensuring that our core functionality maintains functional and hasn't changed. As far as the actual amount of time that they get sent, tested in the actual labs, it's maybe 3% of the overall testing that we've done internally to both validate the functionality and validate the compliance to the specifications. And as far as the cost estimates, I don't have that off the top of our head, but it's high.
Yeah, so there's, lab fees. You got to pay the lab to do the testing, and then, that's not even considering the recertification, right? So if you're thinking long-term, any updates you make to a version, right, or hot fixes, those things generally, depending upon how much material change has occurred to your functionality and so forth, those things would constantly need to be recertified. So it's not just a, hey, we're on the APL now and we're good for in eternity. It's something you have to build in and budget for long-term. Right, because things like the Phipps number changing from 2.0 to 3.0, these are all things that we've had to prepare for from a cost perspective. And so, there's a number of ways that you can get the actual certification depending upon which one you're going through. For instance, Common Criteria, you could actually get it certified in another country, all right, one of the 28 countries that accept Common Criteria, potentially at a lower price point, but depending upon your architecture of your product, whether there are defined protection profiles that exist already. In our case, that was not an option for us. We could not go outside of the country to get Common Criteria certification because of the fact that there was no matching protection profile for Common Criteria that Neil alluded to. We had to get the agent and the server both hardened and validated. We had to get it done here, within the United States. So depending upon where you're located and where your build factories are and things like that, you do have some options as it relates to what the overall cost would be for you to go through the certification process. But a lot of it depends on how many modules within your product actually need that certification, right? So for us, it was 2. And to Neil's point, I don't know what the actual costs were off the top of my head, but we have your contact information here, and I can go ahead and send you some ballpark estimates as to what it costs us under our protection profile for Common Criteria and Phipps and things of that nature, just to give you an idea.
And just to kind of follow up, and this would be our last question, can you talk about whether that significant time and investment that you've taken across these processes, was there one area that kind of took more investment than the others, whether it was the Phipps certification or Common Criteria standards or the last process? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So the Phipps certification was by far the greatest amount of effort that we had to go through. There was a large effort to audit the entire platform to make sure we captured everywhere where we're doing encryption or communication or secret storage, and then retrofit all of those with a new version of OpenSSL that we got Phipps validated. So that was the lion's share of the work. The other requirements with Common Criteria and the DoDIN APL were some effort, but nothing compared to the large effort of retrofitting all of the crypto, and that includes things like native Python libraries, Go wrappers, statically linked C++ libraries. So that was really the lion's share. And in terms of the cost estimates for the JITIC, we're looking at about 4 times what you're posting there.
Right, sure. Well, thank you both for kind of walking through what you've seen in your process. And thank you to our viewers for submitting your questions. For any that went unanswered, the experts from Acronis SCS will follow up with you directly offline. And I want to thank John and Neil for presenting today. And thanks to all of you for joining us. You can continue to link to the archived version of this webinar and see previous Signal webinars on AFCEA Signal Magazine's website, which is www.afcea.org/signal/webinar. And for more information about Acronis SCS, you can visit www.acronisscs.com. That concludes our Signal Magazine webinar. Thanks again and have a good day.